back again. You notice how all of these emotions exist as sensations in the body, right? We can actually feel them in the body. One of the things that we learn to do with mindfulness practice is when emotions arise, to stay with them at the level of the body, to just stay, oh, okay, well, let me just be with that. And as you were saying, Rabbi, before about, how often something's a secondary emotion and you can find out the component emotions. When we just stay with it in this way, and particularly when we're able to stay with it as it manifests in the body, it will reveal itself. Very often we see the associations, the thoughts, the images, we see the other things that are part of this. And we see that it changes all by itself if we only pay attention to it in a loving way and give ourselves permission to feel things. So in a broad way, mindfulness practices help us to have a particular relationship to our whole emotional life, in which feelings come and go and can arise and pass much more freely than they often do when we get stuck in trying to control them or fight them, or when we get stuck in our stories about them that can keep them fixed.
What about when the person, if I or somebody is focusing on all these emotions, and a major part of the emotions or the thought is a lot of self-blame and self-hate and self-loathing, and so it's like a vicious cycle. Like you say, you're in a conversation with yourself, the inner mental chatter. And even as you're trying to focus on that, the mental chatter is, oh, so now you're focusing.
Yeah.
So that itself becomes part of the mental chatter.
Well, excellent point. It's a good illustration of how when we get on a self-critical riff, we can do it about absolutely anything and everything. And it's really it has little to do with reality. It's just this tendency to be self-critical.
The inner bully will use anything, 24/7 to bully you.
Yeah, it's very interesting in the history of mindfulness practices in the psychology world. In the early days, the emphasis was on learning how to pay attention, to be more aware, to be more conscious moment to moment of what's happening, to be more rooted in the present moment. As the research has accumulated and people's experience with it has accumulated over many decades, it's become much clearer that the self-compassion component, the loving attitude toward experience, turns out to be enormously important. A lot of people so I'm a psychotherapist by training. And, when people enter psychotherapy, the secret wish is often to get a whole new personality. Oh, I'm going to get into therapy and I won't have to be Ron anymore with all of Ron's neurotic preoccupations, with all of Ron's fears. I'll be able to be like those other people who are strong, who are confident, who are competent, and the like. And what happens when psychotherapy goes well is at the end of therapy, we're very much still ourselves, only we've made friends with this person. And we see this complex and flawed and lovable human being as a complex, flawed, and lovable human being. And we start to relate to ourselves that way. So so part and parcel of mindfulness practices is really developing a kind of compassionate attitude toward ourselves and to find a different way to relate to this inner critic, because so many of us our inner critic, we'll talk to ourselves in a way we'd never talk to another human being. I have no trouble at all saying, "You idiot, what were you thinking?" I don't talk to friends and colleagues that way. If I did, I wouldn't have friends and colleagues, right? But no problem talking to myself that way. Well, bit by bit, we start to develop self-compassion. And it's actually been studied in the psychology world, and there are certain components to sort of self-criticism versus self-compassion. When we're being down on ourselves, when we feel we've screwed up, when we feel like we're inadequate or we haven't done well enough or we're not doing well enough, we get caught in kind of three things. We get caught in the self-criticism where we talk to ourselves, in very mean ways. We tend to withdraw. We tend to isolate. because we feel bad about ourselves, we feel shame, and shame is kind of about not wanting to be part of the human family or not feeling fit to be part of the human family. So we kind of withdraw. And we get very self-preoccupied, right? We're focused on what a failure we are, how inadequate we are, how bad we are, and all this kind of self-critical, all these negative, self-evaluative judgments about ourselves. And the alternative to this is to deliberately look for self-kindness, right? To deliberately look for common humanity instead of the isolation. What do I mean by common humanity? It's realizing we all make mistakes. We are all flawed. We are all scared. We are all sad. We are all heartbroken. These are aspects of the human condition. These aren't because of my personal failings. This is what it is to be embodied as a human being. And instead of being caught in the narrative about ourselves, we practice more mindfulness. And one of the key elements of mindfulness where and even in these brief practices that we just did, where we're shifting the attention from the narrative thought stream to what's happening moment to moment at a sensory level, that begins to give us a little bit of perspective on thoughts. Psychologists call this metacognitive awareness, the ability to see that a thought is a thought rather than a reality. And the more we practice mindfulness, the more we have this perspective on thought, and we take it a bit less seriously, and we're able to be kinder to ourselves. And guess what? We wind up being much kinder to other people, because when other people screw up, which they do regularly, we realize, oh, like me, I get it. You mess up the same way I mess up. We're in this together, and we start to rely on connection and on the sense of common humanity much more so than on the constant self-evaluative
So
narratives.
correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm understanding what you're saying, and some other things you shared at other times, is a major part of mindfulness the deep recognition that the inner I, is in a very, very powerful place. The inner I is not made up of my thoughts and of my toxic inner critic and of all of the emotions or thoughts that may be very negative or fearful or overwhelming or full of hate and anxiety, but that there is an inner I that is what we would call in our tradition the divine soul or the divine consciousness that is always one with its source, and it has clarity, and it is confident, and it is happy, and it's curious, and it's wholesome, and it's not afraid. And mindfulness is really the ability to be able to create that separation, that differentiation between the I and all of the thoughts that are roaming and running around, maybe like a roller coaster inside of me, but really that ability to create that differentiation and then even look at what's happening inside of me. And again, seeing it from the perspective of the I, which is always in a transcendent and sacred space.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so interesting to me. I'm a bit of a student of the world's religions, and it's so interesting to me how different traditions narrated a bit differently, but they're talking about the same experience, exactly as as you're saying, the divine spark within, or or wisdom within, and sometimes it's called the higher self. In some traditions, it's called the awareness of no self, which is a little confusing, but it's really about not being identified with all the narratives about me and whether I'm good or bad or better or worse than other people. And indeed, mindfulness practices have evolved in a lot of different traditions for precisely this purpose. And it's interesting, Rene Descartes, when he said, "I think, therefore I am," he was right. We construct our stories about the little me, if you will, the me that can be good or bad, successful or failure. That me we construct out of our thoughts, right? It's all these self-evaluative thoughts. Good job. hey, you're doing a good job. That was an interesting reference to pull in, or bad
Just
job.
got a
You're missing,
compliment. Wow,
yeah,
you're good.
yeah, right. You're
Oh,
missing the
you just
point.
got criticized. You must be terrible.
Exactly, exactly. So, and we construct that actually out of the thought stream, out of all these thoughts. And one of the things that happens with mindfulness practice, as exactly as you're saying, is we develop a kind of perspective or separation where we're not identified with and believing in these narratives so much. There is a consciousness and awareness itself, which, again, in some traditions that, it's seen as a divine essence, right? That's able to observe all this, able to understand all this, able to have compassion for it, right? Like the poor little, poor Ronnie, like who's running around here, trying to prove himself, trying to work out his issues with his older brother from childhood, who has perspective on all of this and is not at all judgmental, because really gets it that this is, this is what it is to be human. One of the really nice kind of mindfulness related exercises, this came from Kristen Neff, who's done a lot of work on self-compassion. She suggests the next time you screw up and you're feeling really bad about it, call to mind, and we can all do this for a moment. Think of the last thing you did that you feel bad about, that felt like you screwed up. Shouldn't take long. You got it?
I have it already.
All right, there we go. You think of this thing, and now imagine that a wise, compassionate, loving friend is writing a letter to you about this thing. You've explained to them what happened, and they're writing a letter. What would they say? And you can just begin with the first line or two of the letter. Because if you've had a wise, compassionate friend or a teacher, or mentor, or rabbi, we can usually imagine what they'd say, right? And what are they going to say? The first thing is going to be something like, maybe, let's start with the fact that I love you. And then let's move on to, what were the things that made this happen? Because, I'm sure it came out of, the stresses of the situation or your history or whatever, something that understands that this is natural and human. And we all have things like this. So it's something that's about common humanity, something that's about understanding where it came from, something that's about love. And all of these together really help to diminish our preoccupation with our talking to ourselves about ourselves and our thinking. And, forgive me if this is, I mean, it's tricky because it's different in different traditions, and I'm not sure exactly how this works out in Orthodox traditions, but the idea that one can be fundamentally good or bad from the perspective of mindfulness, no, we are, we have all these different parts to ourselves. You had Dick Schwartz here, I understand, just the other week, and that we all have parts of ourselves that are more noble and parts of ourselves that are less noble. But it doesn't make us fundamentally a good or bad person. We're navigating this and trying to figure out, how to live in a wholesome, loving way in the world with all of this. And so all of this, it's about shifting perspective. So we're no longer believing in these narratives so much. And the nice thing is, though, that there's a technology for it, right? These practices actually do, if we do the practices regularly, they actually bring about these changes where we start to be kinder to ourselves. We start to have more perspective on this, and we start to see our common connection to other human beings.
Do you feel that if sometimes